1977 wasn't completely a bleak year in Manhattan. The Yankees won the World Series for the first time in 15 years, and the election of Ed Koch brought some hope that New York would become safer and better managed. But it would be many years before New York became truly safe again. Murder rates did fall from 1981 to 1985, but rose again as the crack epidemic hit the city. The permanent decline in murders only started in 1994 during the Giuliani administration. As an aside, murder is of course only one form of crime. I focus on it for two distinct reasons. First, it is of course particularly horrific, and when economists total up the social costs of crime, murder plays a particularly dominant role. Secondly, most available data comes from reported crimes, which can rise and fall, not only because real crime rates rise and fall, but also because reporting patterns change. If people give up on the police, then they stop reporting minor crimes. Murder is pretty much always reported and measured. Koch was symbolically important, but the ability of mayors to shape urban destinies is generally pretty limited. Cities are moved by tectonic shifts in the economy, far more than specific urban policies. And Koch's power was particularly limited during the early days because city spending was still controlled by the Municipal Assistance Corporation, the state-sponsored entity that came in after New York City's brush with bankruptcy. Still, Koch's upbeat optimism made many in his city feel better. His irrepressible "how am I doing" generally elicited enthusiastic responses, and he was reelected in 1981 and 1985 by over 75% of the voters. The big story for New York City during the 1980s was actually the economy, which enjoyed a somewhat surprising renaissance. In 1977, the unemployment rate for the city stood at 11%. By 1988, the rate was below 5%. Total private employment in the city was 3.18 million in 1976. And at least one serious analyst predicted that it would fall to 3.05 million by 1985. But instead of falling further, employment rose and was back up to 3.6 million by 1988, the level last seen in the mid-1960s. The city's employment would then drop to 3.3 million in the early 1990s, but by 2016, New York City's employment would be up to 4.2 million, a remarkable resurgence by any measure. Wall Street, or more properly finance, since the Midtown area came to be just as important for securities as downtown, became New York City's economic engine during the 1980s. Like much of New York's economy, finance was a legacy of the city's days as America's premier port. Sugar refining reflected the history of trading with the Caribbean. Garment manufacturing began with sales to sailors and to ships that sold to southern plantations. The New York Stock Exchange has its origins under a buttonwood tree on Wall Street. The city's financiers had long excelled in investing in oceanic voyages. Few traders wanted to bear all the risk of losing a valuable trading vessel. That expertise generalized to new forms of investment, including U.S. government securities, railroad stocks, and eventually mortgage-backed securities. Finance and insurance accounted for 30% of Manhattan's annual payroll in 2014, a whopping $88 billion. The employment share of finance and insurance is considerably smaller, only 13%. The gap between those two figures reflects the enormously high wages paid in finance. In 2014, per capita earnings were over $300,000 in finance in Manhattan, almost 4 times the average earnings in non-financial industries of $76,000. Why did New York finance become so much more important during the 1980s and beyond? Finance is, in a sense, the ultimate information-intensive industry. There's no sector where a bit of better information can make you richer, faster than in financial services. Cities have always had an edge in speeding the flow of knowledge. As the great English economist Alfred Marshall wrote in 1890, in dense clusters, the mysteries of the trade become no mystery, but are, as it were, in the air. The mysteries of finance were also in the air in Wall Street, and young financiers have made their way to New York for centuries to become educated. Even Warren Buffett, known as the Sage of Omaha, got his start in Manhattan, sitting at the feet of the renowned investment guru Benjamin Graham. And during the 1980s, the mysteries of finance became considerably more valuable. The stock exchange experienced a great bull market until 1987. The federal government borrowed trillions to finance the Reagan dream of big military spending and big tax cuts. As the world globalized, New York City could become a financial capital for the planet, not just the United States. Globalization may have killed the older manufacturing sectors in New York. Cheap trade meant that New York was no longer a cost-effective place to sew coats. But globalization also increased the returns to knowledge enormously. And we are a social species. We get smart by being around other smart people. That's why Wall Street grew and thrived in a more globalized world. Every decade or so, there's a spate of anxiety about whether Wall Street will decamp to places with lower real estate costs and lower taxes, like Connecticut. I've long been a skeptic of those arguments, because the urban edge in finance is enormous, and it reflects something fundamental in human beings, our ability to learn from one another when we are close to one another. That ability can be seen in the career of Lou Ranieri. You might know Ranieri from Michael Lewis's first book, Liar's Poker. Ranieri was the father of the mortgage-backed security industry, and yet he got his start in the Salomon Brothers mailroom. That firm, and New York itself, was his college and his university. Another way to understand the rise of New York City finance is that it experienced a chain of innovation during the 1970s and 1980s, not unlike the chains of urban creativity that have been humming along since Athenian philosophy was hammered out 2,400 years ago. The chain starts when Milton Friedman and Jimmy Savage begin the mathematical approach to thinking about the trade-offs between risk and return at the University of Chicago. That approach was then applied to finance by their student Harry Markowitz. This more quantitative approach to finance was then brought to Wall Street by Jack Traynor, Fisher Black, and many others. The quantitative approach to finance then enabled the young Michael Milken, who also started in New York before moving to California, to convince investors that high-yield debt, junk bonds, if you will, carried enough return to offset that risk. The rise of junk bonds then enabled the young Henry Kravis to engage in larger and larger leverage buyouts, like the one that took over RJR Nabisco in 1988. The book and the movie, Barbarians at the Gate, tells that story and provides a picture of New York City during the booming 1980s. Lou Ranieri was part of that story, and so was Michael Bloomberg. His data terminals were yet another step in the quantitative revolution that changed Wall Street over those decades. Bloomberg is also an example of cross-industry leaps of imagination, a variant of what Jane Jacobs described in her famous story of how the bra was invented by a dressmaker, not a lingerie producer. Bloomberg's a technology billionaire, not a financial billionaire. In a sense, he competes with the wizards of Silicon Valley. But Bloomberg had something that none of them enjoyed. He had the wisdom of New York. He had run Salomon Brothers' trading floor, he had run their technology office, and when he was pushed out of Salomon Brothers, he knew exactly what the traders of Merrill Lynch wanted on their desks. No Stanford-trained engineering whiz kid was going to know that. Bloomberg was able to compete so effectively because the city had made him smart. In later life, Bloomberg became mayor of New York and introduced a wall-less office at City Hall, which was modeled on the wall-less office at Bloomberg LLP, which was modeled on the Salomon Brothers trading floor. Those trading floors are something of a puzzle. Here we have some of the wealthiest people on the planet who in any normal industry would sit behind oaken desks, protected by expensive executive assistants. Yet there they are, crowded together on a trading floor, sweating on each other, getting guacamole on each other, if Michael Lewis is to be believed, shouting at each other. Why are they putting up with all that crowding? They're there because it is so important for them to know what's going on in the markets at that point in time. They're there because knowledge is more important than space. And that is why New York City's economy has come back as well. Because today, knowledge is more important than space. And I don't see any reason why that's going to change anytime soon.